Welcome to Real Crusades History. This is the podcast. I'm going to be your host. My name is J. Stephen Roberts. Continuing with our series of podcasts about the Third Crusade, last time we talked about the siege and fall of Acre. Today we are talking about the Battle of Arsuf. Our guests with us today, first of all, fellow Real Crusades History staffer with me, Rand Brown. Rand, how are you doing?
Pretty good.
Excellent. And also, we've got our academic guest with us, Dr. Helena Schroeder. Dr. Schroeder, welcome back.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And from Swansea, we have Dr. Stephen Donnachie. Dr. Donnachie, thanks so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you for having me back again.
Yeah, let's kind of get caught up with where we were last time. We had just talked about the fall of Acre to the Crusaders, and of course, the execution of the prisoners, the Muslim garrison. And we're going to talk now a little bit about Richard's next move. And so obviously he wants to, the ultimate goal, of course, is Jerusalem, but they're not going to make a direct march from Acre to Jerusalem. Of course, they are going to move down the coast with the objective of Jaffa, which is the closest port city to Jerusalem. So it's August 1191 when Richard moves his army out of Acre, and they start marching towards Jaffa. So let's kind of start first off by talking about how Richard arranged his forces and something about his strategy for what he was doing with this march. And I think, Dr. Schroeder, would you like to start on this one?
I'd be happy to. This is often, described, and rightly so, as a very, very brilliant piece of strategic, planning on the part of Richard the Lionheart, because he deploys his army in such a way that it's relatively defensible. And the key elements to that is that he has his fighting infantry, if you want, on the far left flank to the west, facing where the enemy attack is to come from,
right,
protecting his cavalry. And then on the inside flank, along the coast, he has basically his baggage wagons and people who are resting or injured or for any reason essentially not fighting at any one time. And then he has the fleet going down the coast, basically pacing with the army. I think what I'd like to point out, it was very interesting because I've always read this as a great, brilliant, deployment on the part of Richard the Lionhearted. I was recently relooking at R.C. Smale's book, Crusading Warfare, 1097 to 1193, and he points out that this formation is not actually new to Richard. Now, what is new, I think you can say, is the fleet, but he lists quite a number of other, movements, Crusader movements, right from the First Crusade onward, where the Crusaders had rapidly realized that they had to have infantry protecting their cavalry and then use the cavalry at a strategic moment to break out and attack and do a counterattack. So the idea of he points out that it was traditional, actually, when moving your army across distances, to have the cavalry surrounded by infantry. So that Richard modifies a tactic which has actually been proven effective already over 100 years.
Right. Dr. Donnachie, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah. I mean, we have sort of two stages to this move from Acre to Jaffa via Arsuf. In the first couple of days, as Richard moves out along the coast and he comes round towards Haifa, the army becomes somewhat separated out. Obviously, as the people are late in leaving Acre and not everything is on time, and then he gets attacked, and he has to come back and save the Duke of Burgundy, who's in the rear of the army, from being isolated by attacks by Saladin's army. And when he's at Haifa, he then reorganizes the army into this fighting march, as it's called, this tactic of moving down the coast. And we probably shouldn't underestimate the input of the native baronage at this time. Well, Richard obviously has a fair amount of experience of fighting in the Latin West back in France, but he's not had to do this in particular at the time. And obviously he's a bit of a stumble at the beginning, as he moved to Haifa, and then he reorganizes the army and puts the Templars in the van, and then he puts the Hospitallers in the rear of the army, and the rest of the army spread out in between. And it's probably this influence from the Templars, the military orders, and the native barons who are used to fighting in this manner, and they'd used this tactic in the run up to Hattin as they were marching towards Hattin, and in 1183 and back in the Second Crusade and so on and so forth, that give him the experience and knowledge that he can then quickly adapt to using this relatively quickly. And that is quite something to say about Richard, that he's not encountered this before, but makes ready use of it as far as his generalship is concerned. There's quite a statement towards his abilities to adapt to the situation.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that obviously Richard was very good at, was using the knowledge of those around him that he understood, knew what was going on. In this case, the Templars and the Hospitallers were going to be among the most experienced people he could draw from. Rand, did you have any comments about Richard's organization of his army at this point?
Yeah, what was really impressed me was the amount of command and control he was able to exhibit with so many different elements at play, to include having naval maritime support like that in conjunction with a land movement. That, in many ways, that was very much ahead of his time in the sense of the organization of medieval warfare at that time. And it was just a masterful exercise of command and control on Richard's part. Not to allow my bias as having been a Marine officer at one point, but it's a little hard not to gush over the ability of Richard's inclusion of naval support in conjunction with a land campaign like that. It's something you really don't see much of again until you get into more modern periods militarily, and that's what's always really stood out to me, even in the way the Chronicles described it, and then of course the way scholars afterwards, like John Gillingham and people like that, have described it. So.
And as I was saying, that there was certainly a precedent for moving the land forces as he did, but Rand's absolutely right that I don't know of any precedent which also included the naval element.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I mean, like you were saying earlier, Helena, when we were starting off, all through the 12th century, we do have these examples of the Crusader army having to move in this very tight formation, with the infantry screen. I know Baldwin III has got some impressive incidents where he employed that tactic, and like you said, even as far back as the First Crusade, this kind of thing was going on.
Richard moves and he's got this fleet, and the addition of this fleet is probably one of the things that really changes the nature of this particular use of the fighting march in comparison to many of the other ones. He's going along the coast, and because he's got that fleet there and he's taking it very slow, taking it very steady, he covers the ground very slowly so that the army doesn't become tired out. Okay, that gives it more time for Saladin to press attacks on him, but it does allow the fleet to be able to cycle the sick and the injured out and provide more supplies and food on a regular daily basis for them. So that when Richard finally does get to the south, his army's not as tired and worn out, if it's been regularly pressed over several days of consistent combat, but it is a lot more fresher and it's fresher in the field than other armies had been when this had been employed in the past. Think of Hattin, for the classic example of a couple of days of marching through the sun to Hattin, running out of water. By the time the army gets to Hattin and the battle, they're quite tired. And that never really happens with Richard in this sense, because he takes it slowly and he's got the addition of that fleet, which hasn't actually really happened before in the use of this fighting march tactic in the latter East.
Well, and even in his and even in his overall strategy. This is something, having been a military logistician, that I appreciated, or that I got a lot out of Richard's accomplishments, and that was even in his Big Blue Arrow strategic plan, his decision to target the Palestinian coast first instead of just going straight off for Jerusalem was a similar, I think, motivated by similar goals, and that I think Richard knew that the Christian hold on the Levant was not going to be possible unless there was that unless they dominated the access to the sea, resupply from the sea. It just wasn't going to happen. So really, you also see, I think too often Crusader leaders in general get accused of being motivated by, these very unscientific, in terms of military science, these very unscientific goals and objectives and things like that. And really, especially with Richard, you see that's really not true at all. That was a stroke of strategic genius on his part as well. I think to target those coastal cities by which the Christian forces could then constantly resupply themselves through their maritime dominance, or their naval dominance. And continue to fuel the hold or fuel the Crusader kingdoms from the sea, essentially.
Only that maybe if we think about Richard's general career in the sort of the Latin West prior to all of this, is that much of Richard's military activities are determined sort of by speed and maneuverability. He moves across distances with comparatively small forces. Certainly by compared to the army that he's got he's going to have at Arsuf, relatively quickly surprising his enemies. And then here in the Latin East, he's moving very, very slowly, which is completely different to the sort of things he's been used to before. He covers, I think it's in 17 days, what would normally take 2 to 3 days to cover the ground, because he's taking his time and he's being cautious about it. And as well he should. He needs his army rested. He's got a hostile army nearby, and he needs to keep the fleet. And it's quite hard to keep that fleet together at the same time as the moving army, and so it doesn't get too far ahead, because he can't. Once he gets to the unsuitable port, somewhere like Caesarea or Arsuf, where the fleet can come in and dock. That can't happen until the army's actually got there first, because he doesn't necessarily know what he's going to find there.
And they also had to clear them out too. I mean, the docks at Caesarea, they'd actually been basically scandalized. They had to make it, available for her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think he was very much motivated by, and I know they even stress this in a lot of the chronicles as well, that he didn't want to give Saladin the opportunity like they had earlier at places like Hattin. He constantly, if Saladin was going to come attack him, he wanted him to have to attack him where he was going to be uncomfortable. He was going to make Saladin come to him, to a position of strength where he was at. And I think that was again kind of in line with what you all are talking about, and that you're right. It's not necessarily new. But I think it really just goes more to show the credit of Richard as a military leader.
When we're talking about the movement of the army, and Caesarea is one of the coastal towns they pass, Dr. Donnachie, would Caesarea have been completely destroyed or largely destroyed when they got there? Or what do you think?
Well, it's obviously fallen to Saladin back in 1187, and as I recall, I think Saladin had destroyed aspects of its fortifications once things at Acre were going pear-shaped. And it would have been serviceable. It's quite hard to destroy, fortifications and the docks and infrastructure properly. But Richard doesn't stay there very long. He stays there for a few days for the men to rest. So he obviously doesn't do a lot of major repair works that to get things up and running. So it would have been in a state of disrepair, sabotaged and dealt with by any of the Muslim garrison that had left prior to the arrival of this army. But it's probably not sort of laid waste or anything like that to the extent.
Acre, for example, and Ascalon were places that he actually sent garrisons to, and there was a Muslim occupation. I thought Caesarea was one of the ones he did not actually try to garrison, and that they talk about having destroyed the towers and the walls to large, and the port as well.
Yes, but it's serviceable if not utterly laid waste. But Richard doesn't stay there for the long term, because he's moving on, and there are better locations further to the south, Jaffa, Ascalon, for example. It's a service. I doubt it was destroyed to such a great extent that it could not have been serviceable to the fleet and to the army for a brief period of time, but not for the long term, until much more important repair works could be carried out to it.
So let's kind of continue on with looking at Saladin's approach to this. So obviously Saladin, he does have the advantage of speed. A lot of his army is going to be these mounted Turkish archers who can move in and out quickly. Let's go ahead. Dr. Donnachie, do you want to kind of start off by talking a little bit about Saladin's approach to stopping Richard and sort of how his army was organized?
Saladin's problem is that he knows ultimately, obviously, where the Crusaders are going to go. He knows they're going to go down to the coast until they get to Jaffa, at which point they're going to make a decision at Jaffa whether or not to march inland, as is the closest point and the closest port to Jerusalem, and make a strike for Jerusalem, or go further south to Ascalon and threaten the coastline and Saladin's communications with Egypt and his base of power. So Saladin knows he's got to stop the army some point before he gets to Jaffa. He's got to weaken them. So Saladin, I think, is basically, he keeps close to the army. He shadows it as it moves along the coast, constantly harassing it with these sort of horse archers and missiles, troops and things, to keep the pressure up consistently, waiting for an opportunity to present itself where either he can find the ground that is more preferable for him to engage the army on his terms, or for the army as it moves along the coast to become more spread out and for sections to become isolated, in which point he can move in and devour and defeat the army in more piecemeal sections, which is a lot easier than having one confrontation, which was pretty risky. And he does this for day after day after day, all the way up to Arsuf itself, when you get this obviously final sort of battle. And he keeps the pressure up relentlessly. And it's pretty hard, because this army is slow moving down the coast. The Muslims have a lot more maneuverability and speed, and they're endlessly shooting sort of arrows down and darts and things into the slow moving army. And there's all these stories of there were so many arrows just sort of sitting in the sand and in the ground that it was like sheaves of wheat that you could just pick them up under your arms. All these arrows that are being fired into them, and this obviously puts a lot of pressure on the army day after day, which eventually obviously takes its toll. But Saladin's looking for opportunities to weaken the army as much as possible, to give him all the advantages that he can when he has to come to an actual confrontation. Was Saladin looking to have a battle at Arsuf? Not necessarily specifically Arsuf. I mean, he was looking for opportunities to engage the army when it was advantageous to him. And he does this on the 3rd of September, a couple of days before Arsuf, which is one point when Richard almost gets killed when he gets hit by a crossbow bolt and is saved by his armor.
Rand, do you have any comments about Saladin's army or his organization of the attacks?
I mean, honestly, it's what's kind of fascinating to watch, at least through the chronicles and the way they speak of it, is it's almost like you're watching these two very competent commanders almost sort of dance around each other, or dance with each other for over the course of I believe it was about was it a week or two when after he struck out from Acre. I can't remember the exact timeline, but it does
between August and September.
Yeah, I think so, and so you're almost kind of watching these two armies, definitely headed by competent commanders. I think in the end, Richard was more so, but just very much. I think they both realized that they were not. There was a hesitancy on both sides to fully engage with one another, and it's very easy to see that on Richard's end. I think some people miss it on Saladin's end. I think they miss the fact that I think he too was very hesitant to engage him, especially since he knew that Richard's army was being so well led and so well managed and so well supplied and supported that he knew an all-out assault was going to be extremely costly and risky and possibly even could possibly risk a defeat, which carried far greater political implications for Saladin than it did for Richard. And it is interesting to just kind of watch these two dance around each other over the course of several weeks. And really what I think makes Arsuf stand out as a conflict between the two is I think on either end, neither one of them fully intended for it to happen there. I think on both ends in different ways. With Richard, it was the charge of the French rear that was unexpected and prompted him to commit, then and there in that moment. At the same time, it also, I believe, Saladin was not expecting that. I don't think he was expecting a full scale confrontation, nor do I think he was prepared for one, which is why the charge at Arsuf would have rolled, pushed his lines all the way back. But that's I don't know, either Dr. Schrader or Dr. Donnachie, maybe you can shed some more light on that. But that's the way that's the way I've always seen that.
What do you think, Dr. Schroeder?
Overall confrontation go down.
I don't really know. Obviously, we're all speculating a little bit here. I agree with Rand that there was clearly there is a certain amount of testing one another here. Richard's clearly trying to get his army intact down to Jaffa, and he's using as much caution as possible to say he's clearly taking advice. He's adapting to the situation he's in. He's using everything he has, like his fleet. Saladin, I think, has just gone through the massacre. He underestimated Richard in the negotiating with Acre. He basically thought he could play him along longer, and then he's confronted with the fact that Richard is willing to massacre the hostages after he's played him along for 3 weeks and not kept up his end of the bargain. There must have been under a tremendous amount of pressure there from his emirs to do something. So we can't underestimate that factor. And he doesn't really know that Richard's going to be able to sustain a fight. I mean, he can see he's doing a good job with marching as long as he's protected. But I think he did want to provoke Richard to a battle in the hope that he could defeat him. So he didn't really have. He is harassing all the way down the coast, as Dr. Donnachie has already said, and he increases it. I mean, the sources I've said really says he increases it at this point, I think he is essentially trying to provoke a premature attack. He's trying to provoke the Christians into doing something stupid, because that's what will enable him to bring his larger numbers of forces to bear. As long as they're staying on the coast protected, that all that mass of cavalry that he has isn't really able to deploy fully. So what he wants to do is to get the Christians drawn off, as the traditional Turkish tactic is, get them to take the bait, chase his troops, and to pull them off where he can defeat them.
Right.
I think
oh yeah, go ahead, Dr. Donnachie.
I think the one thing that perhaps we should remember is Saladin succeeded at Hattin because he managed to draw the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem out. He could harass it for several days, break it up, and give out all the possible advantages that he could get before coming to an actual conflict with it. And I think he's hoping for the same sort of thing here in 1191 before Arsuf, in that it's August, it's really hot, and he's hoping once again that if he can keep the army delayed and harass it long enough for days on end, to whittle it down, to separate sections of it, to keep the men tired, or anything else, that can give him an advantage, so that when it does come to a battle, or if it does come to an engagement, whether it was of his choosing or not, that he's got as much of the advantages as he can before that. Because battle is a very risky thing, actually having an actual battle. And if Saladin's going to do it, and the same I think is true for Richard, if either of them are going to do it, they want the circumstances to be as favourable to them as possible. And I don't think Saladin is only looking for battle, but maybe on his terms, so he doesn't necessarily know when it's going to be, but he knows he's got to do it some point before he gets to Jaffa, hopefully. And Richard isn't looking really to have a battle if he can avoid it.
Get away with that,
But if it's going to be a battle, then so be it. But I think Richard is prepared to have a battle if it comes to that, but he's not specifically looking to engage in the battle. I think we need to obviously make these changes, because a lot of times when people have looked at the Battle of Arsuf, they've argued,
Yeah.
it's been argued that Richard's seeking to engage with Saladin. I don't think he really is. I think he's just prepared to engage with Saladin if that's what happens.
Richard seemed much more in the posture of he if there was going to be a battle, Saladin was going to have to bring it to him. That's very much how it does come across.
Saladin makes a concerted attack on the army on the 3rd of September, in which Richard is almost killed. One of the many times he almost gets killed. But Richard doesn't follow it up. Richard continues the march. There's no counterattack and things like that. Everything continues as before. The army weathers this attack as it continues to do for the next couple of days until Arsuf itself.
The guest Regis Riccardi says that, and this might be more of a hindsight thing, but it says that Richard was waiting for Saladin to really commit his troops in such a number that once Richard did order the charge, there would be the potential of completely destroying his army. What do you think about that, Dr. Schroeder?
I do think it's probably a lot of hindsight in that. But the other thing I would point out, just going to the same source, that the Gesta Ricardis does say that they expect to be attacked that day, and that the army is given orders to prepare for battle.
Mm-hmm.
When
they're coming out of the woods, right?
Yeah, there's some change in deployment which makes the Christians think that this is going to be first of all, they expected to be attacked in the woods, which I think was unreasonable because the woods would take away from the Turkish mounted archers their main advantages of mobility and line of sight. So, but coming out, for some reason, there's something going on here which made them, with the crack of dawn, everyone put on their armor with great care, as it was expected the Turks to attack. Of course, they've been attacking every day, so you can say, well, that wasn't anything new either. But so that's one thing. As to this idea of Richard if the timing had been better, he could have done better. I think it's almost an apology for Richard, because the Turkish tactic is standard and is classically to pull back.
Right.
And in the situation he's in, Saladin, he doesn't, he's not the invading army. This is not a situation, as in Montgisard, where if you attack him, you can cut him off from his line of retreat, you can annihilate his army. This is not, even La Forbe, where he's coming into their country, and as long as there's an army in being on the part of the Christian army, they can destroy his attacking army. This is a situation where Saladin controls the entire hinterland, and no matter when Richard attacks, Saladin always has the option of pulling back and just letting that attack go into the wind. So I don't think any timing, no matter when Richard had launched his attack, could have been that much more substantially more successful. Clearly, if the commander gives the order to attack, and you attack all at once and a plan as opposed to a little bit piecemeal, what happens here is you're basically getting echelons going in as opposed to a single balled fist. That's not ideal. The ideal is that really for the commander to say, and now, and then it goes in a very ordered fashion, and then it could have been maybe a stronger attack. But I think it's foolish to think that Richard could ever have annihilated Saladin's army in this strategic situation.
Yeah.
All right, so let's kind of move on to, we've kind of already gotten into this, but the actual battle, and this is kind of a good point for that, because as you were saying, Dr. Schroeder, there is this point where Saladin appears to commit more troops. He moves in for a closer attack, just because I think part of the idea here is that the Muslims were able to do quite a bit with these sort of like rush in, rush out harassment tactics, but at the same time, they weren't able to really to stop the army or to stop Richard's advance or to really do the kind of damage that was going to put an end to Richard's campaign. So yeah, it's early September when this full-on attack happens, and it's coming out of this wooded area, and we're just north of Arsuf at this point. So let's kind of go into that. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Schroeder. So what do you think of, again, I know that one thing that we get from some of the sources is this idea that a lot of the Muslim, or some of the Muslim mounted archers had actually dismounted for more accuracy.
That's an incredibly important point, because that, of course, made them very much more vulnerable. But the other point is that the Hospitallers have been under incredible pressure. That's the rear guard. Just as Ibelin and the Templars had been under incredible pressure going into Hattin, the Hospitallers have been taking the brunt of the attacks throughout most of at this point, and they're losing horses at horrible rates. More of them are walking than are riding. And they send the appeal to Richard. They ask twice to be allowed to attack. So they're reaching the end of their patience and their ability to withstand the attacks, or their willingness to withstand the attacks. And we're having a situation where at Hattin, the same things happen. The Templars actually send word to Guy de Lusignan and say to him, "Stop! We can't keep moving with you. We're being attacked too much." It's the same situation here. The Hospitallers are marching backwards and firing backwards, and they're not able to keep up. So either the front of the army has to slow down to prevent the army from being, torn in two and a gap opening up, or something has to happen. They've reached that point where basically they reached the point where either the army was going to have to practically stop, which is what Richard didn't want. They were risking the gap being created, or they had to counterattack. I think that probably the Hospitallers had reached that point and recognized they had reached the point where they had to take action. And the fact that, as you say, that some of the Muslim archers were dismounting and made them vulnerable, and that was also something which obviously was a lure that made people, particularly those familiar with them, say, this is the moment when we can go in.
Yeah.
So basically at this point, the Hospitallers start the charge. Rand, do you want to kind of jump in and comment on this moment in the battle?
Yeah, really. I mean, Dr. Schrader really covered it all. I mean, it covered all the main points. I mean, it definitely was. There was someone on the ground at that point in the engagement that saw, what we call the moment, and that's, to me as well. It's also that, when the mounted archers dismounted or began the process of dismounting, I think Dr. Schrader is absolutely correct. I think that was when someone, most likely someone who's more experienced in fighting in that part of the world. So I would say,
it's significant. It's the Marshal of the Hospitallers. This is not
and Garnier, Marshal Garnier of Nablus. I was blanking on his name.
It's him, and then there's another. And then there's another knight too, a guy named Baldwin, who I think was actually from Rich. He was one of Richard's guys.
He's a Flemish knight.
Yeah. So, and I think they were the ones who kind of saw that moment and went, "That's it. This is when it needs to happen." And maybe some of them may not have even been thinking about sort of the larger engagement as a whole. They may have just been trying, almost in an act maybe of self-preservation, just for their element, just for the rear element, to maybe push back some of these forces that were harassing them. I think it took, at least the way I've read it in the chronicles, it seems like once that rear element shot out in their charge, Richard then recognizes that as the moment for the entire army, and orders the charge en masse up into the scrub, where the bulk of Salahuddin's forces were at.
That's a really good point, Rand. That's a really, really good point, because we talked about in earlier days there have also been harassing tactics, and there have been small. The cavalry has repeatedly, as you say, Richard's actually injured in one of those. They have repeatedly sent out small little bunches of troops to force to get rid of the irritating attacks. So it's not as though they've never used their cavalry before.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Donnachie, would you like to add to this portion?
The Hospitallers in the rear, and the rear is the slowest moving part of the army, the one that's the most likely to get separated out and get left behind, because the other two parts, the van and the middle of the army, will go faster. So it's the most easiest to isolate. So that's why Saladin's focusing on it, because it's the easiest one to pick off of the lot, the stragglers at the end. And the Hospitallers have been under pressure for all of the march, and for the last couple of days of intensity, and it should be quite something that they managed to hold out for a good chunk of the day, under such intense pressure as they're getting towards Arsuf, and twice ask Richard, to do something about it, and he says, no, maintain the position and everything. So it's only towards the end of the day that they've been under such intense pressure that they've finally actually launched an attack at this point in time. And what we have is obviously they charge, and then the people in the section of the army next to them look over, and of course, they're charging, so they charge as well, and so it rolls up the line of the army as basically sections of the cavalry charge out into these dismounted archers and other troops from Saladin's army that got too close, and you have. You have sort of the Flemings go out under James of Avenay. You have the French go out. Henry of Champagne goes out as well with the French, and Richard is obviously further up at the army, who's placed trumpets, groups of trumpeters, around the army to give a signal as and when if a cavalry charge is going to occur. Looks around and sees what's going on, and it's in that moment where he realizes he's got to do something. Which is basically he's got to go with it, or risk possible disaster. And he goes with it, and he orders the charge. And better to have, not quite a unified charge, and then a completely broken one, and risk being parts of the army being lured out and caught out off guard and encircled and destroyed. So he goes with the best option at the time, which is to order the charge. It wasn't necessarily the one he wanted at the time he wanted, and the circumstances he wanted, but he made the best of the situation, and it worked out. He overruns the knights overrun these dismounted archers and other sections of Saladin's army and start driving them from the field.
Let's talk a little bit about what the Crusader Cavalry actually looked like as a unit, sort of rolling over these Saracen troops. Rand, do you want to kind of take that? Like, what must this have looked like?
I mean, it's essentially, ideally, the charge of heavily armored cavalry, or the knightly cavalry. It was you wanted it to be as tight and as dense as possible. The real power of a knight, of a charge of knightly cavalry was not so much like what you see in the movies with horses barreling into people at full speed and things like that. It was really more sort of the intimidation factor. It was I don't know how much everyone's been around horses all that often, but I actually, when growing up in Texas, I grew up on a ranch, and
I'm a fanatic horseman too. I just throw that in.
I'm afraid my experience is limited to falling off them a lot, but
but there really is something to when a horse, or even worse, when a whole group of horses all comes at you at one time. I mean, it's just instinctive. It's psychological. You just out of sheer self-preservation want to get out of that. You want to get out of their way as fast as possible. And the idea of and not only would it be the solid wall of horses coming at you. It'd be these horses have heavily armored warriors on top of them. Who, if you do try to stand your ground, you're not only having to deal with the momentum of a horse, you're having to deal with the rider on top as well. So it was really meant more to break apart formations and to cause them to withdraw or to rapidly try and get out of the way and lose their cohesion and sort of sow confusion and chaos into an enemy unit. You can almost see a very modern equivalent with sort of the way that we use artillery and close air support and armor and heavy armor assets now. It's very much the same thing. It's not meant so much to literally physically crush or smash apart things, although that does happen. It was really meant more for the psychological impact, to sow the confusion, to sow the chaos, to sow the panic into a unit and force them to pull back or to scatter. In which case, then the infantry behind can come in and
right.
do their job, as it were.
Right. The infantry is going to kind of run up and start cutting people down in the wake of
Yeah.
all this.
One thing, when we're talking about the timing of the charge, we shouldn't exclude the possibility, in all our wonder and admiration for Richard the Lionheart, that he might have not actually understood the situation at the rear, that he's up at the front of that army, and he's being asked by the Hospitallers twice, we need it, and he doesn't really believe that it's that bad. He may
Yeah.
really not have realized that they had reached that point, which is why I'm back to, I think it is very significant that it was the marshal of the hospital. It was not some junior, knight who's glory-seeking and out there just and cracks. This is a very senior officer of one of the military orders that makes that
Yeah.
decision to lead that charge, and he's supported.
Good point.
Dr. Schrader, I would have to agree with you. In my opinion, I don't believe in that when that situation very first began developing, I don't believe Richard did fully know what was going on back there.
Although, wasn't he riding up and down the lines? I mean, that's my understanding, that he was actually kind of, he and a group of guys were kind of riding up and down the marching army.
Certainly, but that doesn't mean he was at that point at that time. He
Right.
could have just finished his trip, and he was right at the opposite end when they realized they're dismounting. We've reached that point. This is it. I think that this is a moment where Richard honestly didn't realize that the marshal recognized it, and you say the thing that we give Richard credit for is realizing it's now in train. He responded very rapidly and correctly and took the rest of the army in.
In a lot of ways, it was a moment in military history that reminds one of other moments where it was almost more the situation became so fortuitous for a particular side that it tempts one to think that in hindsight that yes, that was all planned and that was all deliberate and whatnot, but sort of much like Jackson's column coming out of the woods at Chancellorsville on the left flank and things like that. It really was just sort of, it just sort of happened. And Richard was a competent enough commander to be able to recognize that even in the midst of something that he initially was not in control of, he was able to then assume control of, to his success.
Yeah, I'm going to jump back to Dr. Donnachie and Dr. Schroeder just about kind of the cavalry tactic here. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Donnachie. What do you think the cavalry would have looked like as it actually made this charge?
Well, I mean, what you've got is it's very easy to sort of picture this kind of rolling wave of cavalry just like charging up along the beach into Saladin's army, and certainly if you can, there's a sort of stylized image that you might do if you look at Hollywood, all these knights on horses charging in a great wave towards their enemy and things like that. But getting men to charge on horseback in that tight, close formation, close together, knee to knee, as a group, is really, really hard unless you've had ample time to train them. So groups like the Templars and the Hospitallers, who obviously are military orders, have had plenty of time to organize and train themselves, the knights, the sergeants, and all their mounted assets to be able to do this. That's what they do. And amongst the nobility of Europe, the magnates of Europe, the knights, they've trained themselves in their own little groups and little sections of friends and extended kinship networks and under particular lords, and they've had time to train some of this while during the siege is going on and obviously practical experience while the march down the coast is going on. But they're used to fighting together in small units, together with each other, not as part of a wider whole. So we shouldn't really see it as a sort of a united wave rolling up the beach, as it were, but as opposed to clumps and clusters of these particular groups. So Henry of Champagne with his particular retinues and associated friends and allies, or the native barons in Guy, for example, the Templars in their particular groups, the Hospitallers in their groups, all charging at different angles and particular sections and segments, which at that time, rather than as a continuous group that's all going together. Certainly, obviously, as they look up the line and they see different groups are going, they'll each pick a target and move together, because that's what they're used to doing. And it's only sort of like the Templars and the Hospitallers who've had so much experience fighting consistently in this manner, the Latinese, that are able to achieve that on a much bigger and grander scale than the Magnates of Europe itself. And altogether, this adds together to a great weight of sort of this armored fist of heavy cavalry smashing into Saladin's army and driving it from the field.
Dr. Schroeder, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think both Rand and Dr. Donnachie have covered the main points. I would just add to what Dr. Donnachie said. There's something to be said for that, going in, clumps, because one balled fist you can move away from. You get a series of punches down a line.
Exactly.
It makes it much harder for them to just move away and then regroup.
I was gonna say that as well. That was a much better way of describing it. In that, you're right. Unfortunately, there is this perception of medieval charges as being this one long massive wall of cavalry, and that's actually a terribly ineffective way to do that, to conduct a charge like that. It was far more effective when you had these smaller troops, these smaller pockets that would form these dense little heavily armored, highly mobile entities that could then go in multiple different directions along the direction of a charge, and break apart pockets of resistance as they went along. It's funny to hear that, because like my last one of the units I was stationed with when I was in the Marine Corps was a tank battalion, and believe it or not, current tank tactics for tanks and heavy armor assets is still very similar to that. And you think of a tank, they don't put tanks all on one massive line, one massive solid line. No, they work as almost as individual units, and they go into various different locations within a battle space, and infantry follows in behind. So it was funny to hear that, and to I don't think a lot of people in today's day and age realize that in many ways, although the technology has changed, many of those tactics are still with us.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the casualties. How many men Saladin lost. I know kind of the classic figure you see in a lot of books is around 7,000. Dr. Schroeder, do you want to go first on that one?
Oh, I honestly, I don't know, because we're talking medieval numbers. It's always sort of just these big ballpark figures.
Yes.
Lots of guys.
I think we can safely say that more Saracens lost their lives at this battle than Christians. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Right.
Probably a lot more Saracens, because you have this idea that a lot of the mounted archers if they had to dismounted, the number of them would dismount. Once the moment they're dismounted, if they're hit by that charge, they're gone. Mm-hmm. They don't have a lot of a chance. It really was a matter of how many of them had dismounted and how much infantry. We talk about the early phases of this battle are basic. There are actually Saracen infantry mentioned. So there was Nubians who attacked on foot, and Bedouins who attacked on foot. We tend to forget that, because of course the people they were most afraid of were the modern Turkish archers. But there were infantry engaged. They would have had a really hard time once that cavalry was deployed. But the heavy cavalry, the Kurds and the Syrian cavalry, not the Turkish cavalry, but the Arab cavalry, probably got away. They probably just turned around and got out of there.
What exactly were the consequences of the Battle of Arsuf, this Crusader victory? I think you kind of get two varying opinions. And you mentioned R.C. Smale, Helena, and I know that in his book, he kind of almost sort of downplays Arsuf. He sort of says, well, it was kind of almost just like a larger scale of what had already been going on all through this march. And then you get historians who say, well, no, this was a really important victory. This had serious psychological consequences for Saladin's army. It also did deplete his numbers. And this victory, in a lot of ways, you could say, sort of. It did have this decisive factor in that it meant that the crusade was going to continue and that they were going to continue to occupy the coast. So would you like to start with that, Dr. Donnachie, the consequences of Arsuf?
We've sort of got the problem is that those who have taken sort of very maybe negative view of Richard have tend to downplay the importance of Arsuf, and those who are very pro-Richard tend to play it up a bit. All we can say really is that what Arsuf achieves is that Saladin, despite a few counterattacks made by various forces that are not caught off guard or get brought in, Richard's left in charge of the field. He's driven Saladin's army away from the field. He's got that tactical victory. It allows him to move on to Arsuf and then on to Jaffa with minimal harassment and problems created by Saladin. So he's driven away. So he's able to achieve his immediate objective of the operation. And yes, Saladin, after this point, doesn't really seek to engage Richard in any major battle. No concerted effort of forces. All the future engagements are built around things like skirmishing and attacking smaller parts of the army and garrisons, or scorched earth raiding, counter-raiding, things like that. And in that regard, Saladin Arsuf is a victory for Richard, but it's not decisive in the long run, because Saladin's driven from the field. He's taken casualties, and probably a significant number, but he's still got his army largely intact, and he's still there between Richard and the ultimate goal of Jerusalem. And though he's taking casualties, he writes off for more reinforcements to be sent because he can call upon them. Richard's run, I don't know, it's a tactical victory. He's not run, it's a battle, but he's not won the war. He hasn't changed the outcome massively of how things go. He's still got to deal with Saladin for the next year, and any move he's going to make towards Jerusalem, he's still got to deal with him. So we should, praise Richard for his ability to manage a changing situation and take advantage of the circumstances as they adapt, and his ability to adapt to them. But it's not some great victory that perhaps should be lauded. It's not something that dramatically changes the overall course of the Crusade. It's not as decisive in that same immediate way as perhaps Hattin was for Saladin. It's an important battle, and it's one of the important battles of the Third Crusade. But its effects are not long-term in that regard.
What do you think, Dr. Schroeder?
It's a less important victory than Montgisard. Where, is the Baldwin IV that basically destroys Saladin's invading army and forces him to escape on the back of a pack camel with tremendous humiliation. So it is not a victory on the same scale as Montgisard. But it's an important victory.
I would even argue, at least from the way that they are portrayed in the chronicles, both Christian and Islamic, that it wasn't even regarded as important a victory as Richard's operations around Jaffa much later. Even in the chronicles, it seems like more emphasis was placed on his rescue and relief of Jaffa. Even with the Islamic chroniclers, that Saladin seemed a lot more upset about the outcome of that than he did Arsuf. And I've always kind of been curious as to how, because I know, and as I'm sure the rest of you do, that Saladin had there's a lot of political pressure on him, maintaining his Egyptian-Syrian coalition, as it were, in the midst of the Crusades, that he faced far greater threat from his own subordinates than he ever did the Christian Crusaders. And I've always been curious as to how he essentially survived politically after Arsuf. But he seems to have done so.
He died pretty quickly after. Arsuf. So I thought you were talking about Jaffa. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, Arsuf. After Arsuf, unlike Jaffa, whereas even the Islamic chroniclers mention after Jaffa that Saladin was in a very difficult spot politically with his own people, whereas Arsuf, you don't get that much of an impression. So,
well, to be fair, I mean, the Muslim sources do definitely kind of linger on Arsuf and talk about how horrible and awful it was.
Yeah, and almost more in the sense of what I'm sure was more just injured pride. Here they had, they had been riding the waves of victory ever since Hattin, and then, now you have Richard show up, you have the loss of Acre, you have the massacre of the prisoners, and then you have this defeated Arsuf, on top of it. So, but as far as Salahadin's actual, I guess you could say, for lack of a better term, reputation or his political standing, it doesn't seem to have suffered all that much after Arsuf, which is something I've always been a little curious about.
I don't know about that.
From my understanding, from what I recall, Saladin in the aftermath of Arsuf, in his own letters, starts striking up as that, he's actually done a pretty good job. I mean, he's delayed Richard, he's held up the army, he's, harassed them, and it's taken them almost 3 weeks to cover a journey that should take only a few days. And he writes, that this is a victory for him, or, he has done a very good job, that, it's not as clear cut. And perhaps, obviously, Saladin is obviously going to employ, certain rose-tinted view of his own success and actions in regards to Arsuf. But at the same time, I mean, this is true. I mean, he, as far as from his perspective, he has, managed to harass this army and keep it pinned to the coast all the way, weakening it, making it use up its resources, playing to his advantage, for the better part of 3 weeks. And perhaps we shouldn't, underestimate that other people have, realised that, that other emirs have also maybe recognised that as a factor, that maybe actually Saladin hasn't done as bad a job as we might make out.
Yeah.
One of the problems is that a lot of the source material that we have, a lot of the chronicles, are obviously written sometime after the Third Crusade. And with the hindsight of knowing how the Third Crusade turns out, they want to, especially those that are pro-Richard, obviously, where he's hero protagonist, is to play up the importance and the effect of Arsuf. I seem to recall there's stories of that, Saladin's troops are running as far away as Damascus or something from Arsuf, which is a pretty long run, but but it's that sort of narrative, is that they want to play that up more,
but
because they know what happened.
But Baha'u'ddin and Ibn al-Athir definitely do talk about Arsuf as a serious setback for the Muslims, and those are both written later too.
But if you look at the Gesta Regis Recadi, it's an interesting thing, because which is a totally Christian source, after the fact, totally pro-Richard. So all of those, but they talk about how Saladin chides his emirs because they had been bragging about what they could do, and he scoffs at them and mocks them for their failure, which would be a very interesting take. Was Saladin the one who really decided to attack, or was he in the same position as Richard, where in fact people at the front started getting overconfident, started dismounting, and opened up this? Do we know that Saladin actually was responsible? And if he wasn't, if he didn't give the order, if it was that kind of a situation that just developed, he could stand back and say, "Idiots, I told you."
Exactly. Yeah, it almost, in a weird roundabout way, actually would have enhanced his power over the emirs, in that he would have been able to hold the shame of the defeat over their heads, and say, we lost this because of you, not because of me.
Exactly.
I do think
if there was any kind of independent action by lower commanders that he could really distance himself from, he could use that exactly to strengthen his position.
I do think, though, we too have to kind of consider what the consequences would have been if this had been a Muslim victory, if the Crusaders had been defeated. I mean, I think, we can probably assume that would have been the end of this crusade, and I think it would probably call into question the future of a Christian Outremer at all.
I think it would have. I would agree with that, absolutely. I think at that time, a defeat, Richard just didn't have the manpower, he didn't have the strategic assets available if he had been defeated at Arsuf. Also, there's the question of, yes, you had the ships waiting offshore, you had the fleet offshore, but where else would they have gone? If they had to withdraw, I think they really would have been caught between, the rock and the hard place, as it were. So,
Yeah, so I guess in that respect, we could kind of consider, what was decided at Arsuf did have some impact on the future of, the Crusader states in the coming century.
I think that the critical point is maybe not Arsuf itself, with Richard, is that while it's it's a victory for him, and it bloodies Saladin's nose, and makes Saladin think twice in the future. I think the critical point for the Crusade comes a lot later, when he's in control of Ascalon, and when it's raiding places, sort of caravans near Darun and things like that.
But we couldn't have gotten to that point without Arsuf.
Obviously, couldn't have got to this point at this time. I mean, the problem is, if Richard had died in this battle, or even if he died by being hit by that crossbow bolt in a couple of days earlier, which obviously quite foreshadowing, I suppose, for 1199, is who's going to take over the command of the army? The only who else is there? I mean,
or if the army had been destroyed.
Or if the army had been destroyed. I mean, James of Avenay is killed in the battle, and this is a great blow to the army itself, because he'd been there throughout the siege of Acre and was very popular. And the only other sort of great magnates from the Latin West who are still floating around in the army that are of sufficient size, if not necessarily caliber, the Duke of Burgundy and Henry of Champagne. And what are they? Could they have carried it off?
No, they couldn't. I mean, we know Hugh de Burgundy never showed any particular tactical competence. Henri de Champagne was maybe okay, but not a stature. Probably couldn't have held them together.
He was certainly quite young at the time, so...
Yes, very much.
Yeah, and if this had been a defeat, I mean, I think we can assume this would have been somewhat similar to Hattin in terms of... I mean, unlike Saladin, there wasn't a bunch of troops that could just be called upon from the hinterland. I mean, the whole army could have been annihilated, and that could have had serious consequences for whether or not there's even gonna be a
if Saladin
Crusader
had
state.
If Saladin had won a victory at Arsuf that was on the same scale as Hattin, then yes. The problem is that Richard wins a victory for the Crusaders at Arsuf that isn't on the same scale as Hattin was in the end.
Right. Yeah.
So if he'd had, it might have been a very different matter as well. If he'd managed to catch all of Saladin's army and destroy it in the field, as it happened at Hattin. But we've got a lot of questions of what ifs,
But Dr. Schroeder was just pointing out that would that have even been possible? Would an annihilation victory have been possible for the Crusaders?
I don't think so.
Probably not.
I don't think either way. I don't think it would have really been possible for Saladin to annihilate this army, even if he had crushed the Hospitallers. Richard still had such force. He had his reserves. He had sufficient force to actually. If he had stopped his forces to come back, and I don't think that there was a chance in this configuration with the ships.
It would have been extremely costly. I think if Saladin had won a victory, I think it would have been an extremely costly one for him.
The reason I bring that up is just because also, talking about Montgisard, which again, Montgisard was a tremendous victory for Baldwin IV, but kind of almost the same thing sort of applied there, Dr. Schroeder, where Saladin was able to raise another army of pretty much the same size the next year, as I understand it.
He doesn't come back again for 2 years, actually.
Okay, 2 years. 1179,
Exactly.
He destroys Jacob's Ford a couple years after that. But anyway, it almost kind of like brings us back to this general problem of the Crusader states, which is that the Muslims, they've got a lot of territory around from which they can draw additional troops, whereas, the Crusader states, they're pinned against the coast. Numbers are always a problem, that sort of thing. So in that respect, I guess, we've kind of gone over, Arsuf wasn't a crushing victory like Hattin was for the Muslims. But, in terms of what we're talking about, what the Crusader states were capable of, and what Richard was really... it almost seems like this was the greatest victory that possibly could have been achieved in that moment, given the resources they had.
I would stand by that.
Just to kind of like balance out our little. But
no, I would absolutely stand by that. I mean, it was the best that he could have done given the situation that he was placed in.
Right.
Which really, that's all a great military leader can do. It's not that, we very rarely do you ever get the 100% solution. Usually if you can pull off a 75% solution, that's what you were supposed to do.
Right.
That's the best it could have been for you, So
is any war really decisive?
Yeah, he made the most of what he had. We talk about, even if Arsuf had been a victory on the scale of a Montezard, I would agree with Dr. Schrader that I don't think that even would have been possible in the situation. Therefore it's kind of a moot point, to speak of it in that way. Arsuf very much was the best that he could do in that situation, and he achieved it handily.
Yes,
So,
if Saladin had fought a campaign along the coast of England and had driven Richard's army from the field on England, that would have probably been about as good as he could have done too there. So, anything else from anyone, or have we?
I think we've
flogged it. Have we geeked out over the Third Crusade enough?
I think we have.
Great stuff. That's a really great conversation. That kind of brings us to the end of this podcast. I'm going to go ahead and say thanks to everybody. Rand, thanks for helping out with this one. It's always good to have you.
Hey, my pleasure, as always.
Excellent. And Dr. Schroeder, as usual, we're so happy to have you.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So I know you like to kind of keep us up to date on what's going on with your blogs. What's going on?
You'll probably have liked my most recent blog, which was tried to just counter some of the nonsense that's out there, trying to blame the Crusades for ISIS, and so I sort of took that to task.
Oh yes, I saw that.
Thinking that somehow or other.
I've noticed things even on my end, in some pretty secular avenues, places I wouldn't think to find them. The word similar to what you're writing, Dr. Schrader, must be getting out there, because I'm not seeing. I'm seeing less and less of the worn out, tired accusations of the Crusades and all this kind of thing, and I'm actually seeing more and more areas almost defending the crusading mentality more often.
That's a whole other podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll put a bookmark in that one.
And in places that are frankly surprising. That I wouldn't have thought, would dare to, to break from the postmodern secular script, as it were. But
Rand, one of the things that's really upsetting to me is that it's very, very dangerous to think that ISIS is just about a battle they won 700 years ago, because it takes away, it distracts us from the fact that there are reasons why they hate us now. And it's just
exactly.
Even if you want to apologize and you think the Crusades are horrible, if you seriously think that apologizing to the Crusades is going to end ISIS being our enemy, you are
exactly.
Well, anyway,
you are severely detached from reality.
I promise you both, we will do a podcast about this subject right here. Anyway, let me go ahead. Let me give my thanks to Dr. Donnachie. Dr. Donnachie, thank you so much again for being with us. It's always great to have you.
Not a problem. Thank you very much for having me.
Excellent. Well, I guess that brings us to a close. Again, this is Real Crusades History. You can find us on realcrusadeshistory.com. We are on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And we do release a new podcast on the history of the Crusades every 1st and 15th of the month. So next time we are going to continue with the Third Crusade. And I think what we're going to talk about for next time is going to be really the diplomatic aspect of Richard and Saladin's interaction. So that'll be good too. So thanks very much.